This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
In the ancient Near East, around ancient Israel, the dead never really went away. They were always part of the lives of the living. And if you did not, as one of the living, properly care for your ancestors after they departed, they could make your life a living. You get the idea. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. It is Iron and Myth time, episode number 37, as we welcome back our usual roundtable. And we'll go clockwise around the grid as I'm looking at them on my screen here. Pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado, Doug Van Dorn, best-selling author, award-winning screenwriter, Brian Godawa, and our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Fellows, thanks for joining us. I'm surprised this is another topic that I'm surprised we had not yet addressed. The cult of the dead around ancient Israel and its influence on the Israelites. I mean, Doug, let me jump in with you here because this is something we saw firsthand, some of the megalithic monuments to the dead when we were in Israel 2 years ago. Saw Gilgal Rephaim, saw the Serpent Mound of Bashan, saw the dolmens, the tumuli that were around there, saw another megalithic site overlooking the Jordan River, similar to Gilgal Rephaim. And according to the archaeologist who's done the most recent work at that site and at Gilgal Rephaim, all of these monuments devoted to the cult of the dead dating back to thousands of years before the biblical era. I mean, what is it about that region that seems to attract this particular cult?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's just such a fascinating thing. When I was preaching through Luke, Derek, I think this is about a year ago, I guess. I'm kind of doing a Luke Acts thing, and just focusing on the way that Luke structures his book so differently from Matthew and Mark. So he has Jesus entirely in Galilee in one big long thing. He never goes out of Galilee. And why in the world is he doing that? Well, it's all this cosmic geography stuff that's taking place there. And you think about something like the story with Legion, and I think I might have even learned this from you, that the whole idea of the pigs, like, why would the demon want to go into the pigs? What are pigs even doing there? Well, this is certainly not something that Jews would have raised. It would have been something that the Gentiles were raising. And the whole area where this took place on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee, in the Bashan, and this guy is hanging out in tombs. And, that whole area is littered with these dolmens, which are these tabletop, two vertical pillars with a giant slab over it. And the word dolmen even means a table. And so you have in that story this guy in tombs and wanting to go into the pigs, and you end up learning that it would have been these Gentiles that were raising the pigs in order to essentially feed their dead ancestors with the food, because there was this cult of the dead that seems to have been kind of centered. Now, not all the dolmens are centered right at the Wheel of Giants and the Serpent Mound. They're more, I suppose, just a little bit to the northwest over by Gamla, and then up in the Hula Valley and stuff. But nevertheless, there's all kinds of stuff that's taking place even where that wheel is. And my word, I mean, it's a wild thing that this cult of the dead seems to be this thing where these people are either worshiping their dead ancestors, or they were worshiping the God of their dead ancestors, and they were trying to invoke their ancestors, sometimes feeding them, giving them liquid, libations and all this kind of stuff, doing rituals between the Serpent Mound and the wheel, or you have kind of the priestly house on top of the mound, and then you have whatever, circumambulations around the wheel complex are going on, so that they end up making their way to that central tumulus and doing whatever they thought was happening in terms of maybe letting the ancestor finally get his rest or whatever. And the whole area is just infused with this. We'll talk about, I'm sure, the meaning of the word Rephaim, which is the giants, which is exactly what Og was, which is deeply related to the idea of the cult of the dead, especially in Canaanite religion. And of course, Canaan, the Mount Hermon being the mountain that presides over that whole area with the watchers. I really think that, I mean, I don't know if this was the epicenter on Earth of this, but it sure might have been, because there's more dolmens in that area of northern Israel than there is anywhere else on the face of the earth. So that's why I kind of just suggested to us that we talk about what in the world is going on with this. And, you know, we'll see that the scholars have argued whether Israel is involved with the cult of the dead or not. I think it's pretty obvious that they were. You just think about a story with Samuel and calling the witch of Endor, and all of a sudden something happens on the other side, or, you know, the laws in Leviticus forbidding necromancy and all this kind of stuff. So it's a wild topic.
There's also prophetic denunciations in Amos and in Jeremiah that specifically refer to it. I wanted to jump in and just say, one of the dissertations that we've all read here is by Joseph Lewis, called Cults of the Dead in Ancient Israel and Ugarit. And he defines cults of the dead. I wanted to just get it out there because we're always talking and assuming things, you know. And, you know, it's a simplified definition, so at least it can be something that our listeners can grab onto to begin with as we dive deeper. And he defines it as those acts, the cults of the dead are those acts directed toward the deceased, functioning either to placate the dead or to secure favors from them. That's his simplified definition of it. And of course, like, you know, there's a lot to talk about, but.
So there's the Lexham Bible Dictionary gives one that's, it's not as, I like that one, Brian, because it's a bit more specific. This one just says it's the practice of communicating with and worshiping the dead. And that's all it was. And, you know, I don't know if we've talked much about this at all, that this idea of necromancy, you know, all those laws that are related to that in the Old Testament, so many people think that's not a real thing, and that's why it's forbidden, which to me doesn't make any sense, right? It's like it was forbidden because everybody was doing this because somehow there was some real spiritual power that was attached to it.
There's a book that I found very, very helpful in the research that Sharon and I have been doing over the last few years. It's by a fellow named George Heider, Heider, called The Cult of Molech, A Reassessment, which is hard to find if you're looking for a print copy, but the folks at Faith Life, Logos Bible Software, have now made it available. So if you got Logos, you can actually get it as part of your Logos package now. And it's really interesting because he goes through the history of the study of Molech. And of course, you know, that's an entity that is familiar to all of us who've read the Old Testament, because God has some very specific things to say about the worship of Molech. But Heider comes out with the conclusion that no, Molech is not the name of the sacrifice that was performed by the Phoenicians or the Canaanites. This was the name of an entity. He traces it back to other older entities that were known elsewhere in the ancient Near East. But he made a really interesting observation, and this is related to one of the prohibitions on consulting with mediums and necromancers. In Leviticus 20, beginning at verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel or the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones," and then it goes on from there. And then the next paragraph begins, the final section of that scripture. If a person turns to mediums, which is the word ovoth, which is also translated elsewhere as spirits of the dead, and necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people. Heider's interpretation of that is this: the unifying principle of Leviticus 20, verses 1 through 6 is not merely illegitimate cultic practices, but the practice of the cult of the dead. This realization makes sense also of the condemnation of the guilty party's entire clan in verse 5. God saying, I will set my face against that man and against his clan and cut them off from among their people. So you're putting your entire clan at risk of being ejected from among Israel if you were to worship this entity Molech. As we saw at Mari and Ugarit, a couple of Amorite city-states in the ancient Near East, the cult of the dead is a family affair to secure the blessings and avert the wrath of past family for the sake of the family present and yet to be. In other words, the worship of Molech involved consulting mediums and necromancy. He connects all of these things together so that you were securing, perhaps sacrificing your children to consult with the spirits of what you thought were your family ancestors, so to bless your present family and the family yet to come. So I think a very interesting connection between a cult of Molech. The firefighters are out there running down the highway and the dogs are upset. And this practice of consulting the dead. It was connected to the practice of sacrificing children to Molech.
Wow.
Jed, you made a really interesting connection that in the days of Jesus, in your study of the cult history of Banyas, Caesarea Philippi, and the timing of Jesus' mission to Caesarea Philippi, connecting it to the Roman festival called, was it Paternalia?
The Parentalia.
Parentalia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Parentalia.
Sure.
Which was just sort of a Romanized form of this veneration of the spirits of the ancestral dead.
That's exactly so. The ubiquity of the cult of the dead, again, is clearly evinced by the literature of multiple fields like anthropology and archaeology, religious studies. It's one of the older things in archaeology that we have evidence for. And as you point out, the Parentalia is just a continuation of that practice that we've been talking about tonight. Parentalia was the Roman festival of the dead, which also overlapped with the Lupercalia, which was a festival in homage to Pan, who was the patron god of Banias. But the Parentalia spans a cycle of time of about 9 days laid over the Lupercalia, in which very much as you find ancestor cults of reverence of the dead in other cultures, those sorts of things are taking place under the umbrella of Greco-Roman religion at Paneas, in which you have certainly sacrifices and placation of the dead, but also meals that are also offered to and taken along with the dead. And the dead, of course, in question here are not human dead, although that's the facade, the theatricality that they use. But are these older god kings of the ancient world, which now inhabit the abyss. And my research has led me to conclude that Jesus' mission to Caesarea Philippi coincides with all of this. And in fact, the transfiguration, if I'm right, the transfiguration is actually taking place at the same time that the last day of that festival, which was designed to placate the most malevolent and horrible of those spirits in the Parentalia, that Jesus is climbing Mount Hermon and the Transfiguration is taking place, and so there's this juxtaposition against the fulfillment of the redemption of humanity under Jesus against the backdrop of these old gods being swept aside and put on notice that had been honored in this panoply at Caesarea Philippi. So yeah, the Parentalia is just a Greco-Roman continuation of these other practices that we've been talking about.
You mentioned the most malevolent of those entities worshipped during Parentalia. Was there a specific one, or just the most evil of them in general at the end of that festival that were being appeased?
These, through the lens of Greco-Roman culture, these would have been the spirits of their dead loved ones and dead ancestors. And again, looking at it through the culture of Greco-Roman society, the most mischievous and ill-mannered of these dead relatives were supposed to be most active at the last part of this festival. So there weren't any necessarily gods per se that were associated with it, but just the most ill-tempered, ill-mannered of those spirits, which of course, looking at it through the context of the Bible, we get a clarified picture of what those spirits actually are and why they behave the way that they do.
Hey, Judd, when you look at the dictionary entries, you see that the Rephaim are related to this cult of the dead in every one of these entries. And I can remember reading Mike Kaiser's work on this and distinguishing between the Rephaim of the Bible and then I forget what they call them, it's something very close to that, Rephaim or something like that, of the Canaanite world. And him saying that they're never described as giants by the Canaanites. They're, like I think you said, the kings or the heroes of old or something like that, which is obviously very much an overlap with something like Genesis 6:4. But they're never described as giants. And yet, nevertheless, they're kind of like these shades of the dead. They seem to have some kind of a central place in all of this, so that it's not, the way I understand it is it's not just entirely your own dead ancestors, but there's something maybe more nefarious or something going on there. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the difference between the way that the Canaanites in the Old Testament depict the Rephaim, and then especially as it's related to this area of Caesarea Philippi, and then on down the Bashan to the Wheel and the Serpent Mound, and all the way down to the lake?
Personally, I think that they're variations on a theme. I mean, there would have been things that the occupants of Galilee in general, but also the native Etyrian population, which had been Hellenized by that point in time. The Etyrians were a Semitic people who live in that region. Actually, the Druses that live in that area today are direct descendants of those Etyrians. But they would have, having those older West Asian traditions, they would have seen the connective tissue between something like the parentalia and these entities that are described, let's say, in Ugaritic literature, which also, to one form or another, at least some of them would have been familiar with by that time.
What's interesting is, among the many interesting things about this research, which is why I've been pulling on the threads of the Rephaim and the Amorites for years now,
right?
Is that of the many Amorite cities that have been excavated, archaeologists have yet to find what you find in almost every Western city, American city, which is a communal graveyard, a community graveyard. Sometimes they're in churchyards, sometimes they're, a very pleasant shaded spot somewhere in the city. But the Amorites buried their ancestors below the floors of their homes so that they could continue the care and feeding of the ancestral dead through the ritual performed on the night of no moon, the 30th day of the month, which was called the Kispum, where they would feed them bread through smearing bread on the statues that represented their ancestors. These were the household idols, the teraphim, that Jacob's wife stole from her father Laban. And then they would pour out a drink offering, sometimes through a libation tube that was right down to the corpse of dead grandpa, so that he could be fed and watered every month, because if you didn't keep up this feeding of your ancestors, they would cease to exist in the afterlife. This is an ancient Amorite practice. The Amorites were the first one recorded who did this. I think the first mention of it in Sumerian text is like 24th century BC, around the time of the Sargon the Great, and or a little after. But this continued down into biblical times. I mean, David deceived his father-in-law Saul, or well, actually David's wife Michal, Saul's daughter, deceived the guards who were coming to kill David by putting the teraphim, one of the teraphim, in the bed next to her. So even David, who was the apple of God's eye, still had this practice, or at least had these trappings of this practice going on inside his own household, something that had been going on for thousands of years. So how do we identify these dead then? I know we talked about the subject of demons, and we talked about the Nephilim, the giants, in the past. I mean, just to make it clear for people listening or watching, who were these spirits then? I mean, assuming that God wasn't telling Moses, don't consult with mediums and necromancers because it's a waste of time, who was answering when people were performing these rituals and sacrifices?
Brian, did you run into this in your study of Egyptian mythology and cultic practices?
You know, I didn't. There may be something, but I didn't come. The Egyptians didn't seem to me to have any sort of involvement like that with the dead. They had a whole, people are familiar with the Book of the Dead, Egyptian Book of the Dead, but that was simply the description of the soul's journey through the 12 gates of Hades, or whatever they call it, the Duat, right? But there's nothing about the sort of interchange that I found, interchange between the dead. It's sort of like they had it seemed to be more permanent to me. I may be wrong on that, but I didn't. But my research was focused on this when I was researching for my book, my novel, Jezebel, Harlot Queen of Israel. And I have some extensive descriptions of these activities. And that was fascinating to me because, in fact, let me zero in on just one passage so we can help bring some biblical examples to the case. Amos 6, he's around the time of King Jehoram, and of course that was during the time of that era of Jezebel and such. And Amos, in Amos 6, 4 through 7, he is proclaiming a judgment, and he's referring to the different elements and components of this cult of the dead, particularly focusing on the Marzeah feast, which is, that's the feast for the dead. And he says, woe to those, and you listen to this and it just sounds like, if you just read it in English and you don't really know about the context, it just seems like, the house of mourning, and, they have a feast, and that makes sense. But no, these are actual elements and components, and I'll focus in on one of them that I found very fascinating. I don't know if they have it in this one, but anyway, woe to those who lie in their beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches. Of course, ivory was brought in from Tyre, and so there's that connection there. And they eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp. So they're having these feasts, they're singing songs, who drink wine in bowls. That was something that they literally would do, drink wine in bowls, anoint themselves with finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. So he's talking about this, and I think that Joseph here in the context is a reference to, Israel in some form. And he's saying, look, you do all these feasts for the dead, but you don't grieve, which is a grieving process, including a feast, right? And he goes, but you don't do this for the ruin of Joseph that we're in the midst of now. Therefore, they shall now be the first of those who go into exile. And the revelry, which is the word in Hebrew, Marzeah, which is the Marzeah feast, and the revelry of those who stretch themselves out shall pass away. And so this is the feast that when someone would die and they would, do all these things like we talked about, libations and have a feast, and they would also build or create this, go to the Ob or the Ove, which was this, circular pit that led down to Hades that they believed, right? And they would engage in occultic ceremonies to try to reach the dead. Sometimes they would even put ladders in there in the hopes that they help the spirits climb up the ladders. It's kind of funny. But and there was one other passage in Jeremiah that also is referencing this Marzeah feast that I just think would be helpful. Jeremiah 16, 5 through 8. For thus says the Lord. Now, Jeremiah is during the time of the exiles coming down, right? And so they're being judged. Israel's being judged for their rejection or disobedience to God. For thus says the Lord, do not enter the house of mourning. That's the house of Marzeah. Or go to lament or grieve for them. So in other words, I think the context here is, the people are going to be judged. They're going to die. Don't go and lament for them like you would normally for the dead. For I've taken away my peace from this people. My steadfast love and mercy, both great and small, shall die. They shall not be buried. No one shall lament for them, or this is interesting, or cut himself, or make himself bald for them, shaving. And also tattooing was part of the process.
Sounds exactly like Leviticus.
Yeah. But I'm going to focus in on the cut himself because that's kind of interesting. No one shall break bread for the mourner, comfort him for the dead, nor shall anyone give him the cup of consolation to drink for his father. You shall not go into the house of feasting to sit with them, to eat and drink. So these are all components of the Marzeah feast that was done, when people died. And but that notion of cutting himself, now that's an interesting thing because that came into play with my Jezebel story. Because one of the components of the Canaanite or the Syrian or Canaanite Marzeah ritual that we see creeping up in various scriptures that Israel would do would be cutting themselves. And of course, you are familiar with the passage where Elijah's on the Mount Carmel, and what do the prophets of Baal do when they can't get the result? They start cutting themselves. Well, that's calling upon the dead. That's a calling upon the dead, by the way, to help them. But what's interesting about that is rooted in one of the sort of scrolls of the Baal epic, where the story is told of. It's called the El's Divine Feast, and it's an interesting story because it talks about how El, who's the highest god in the pantheon. Baal's below him, right? Baal rises to become the most high, but El is always the sort of ethereal overlord of it all. But he's kind of like removed in their stories. So he invites all the gods to a banquet at his home, and it's called the Marzeah. And Asherah and Anat are there. Anyway, the short of it is El gets so drunk that he passes out in his own excrement and urine. He vomits and he excretes and he passes out on it. In other words, it's making him look pathetic.
Yeah.
And so Anat and Asherah then go out hunting and they return with some cure for El's hangover. And so one of the elements of Anat, Anat, that's the Marzeah feast. But then Anat was also the brother or the sister of Baal, the juvenile sister of Baal. And there's a story about how Baal, this is where the cutting will come from. That's the Marzeah feast, that notion. But then the cutting comes where there's a story where Baal goes to fight Mot. Wait, is he called Mot in the Baal epic?
The death god, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, who's the Lord of Hades, right?
Yeah.
And so he goes, but Mot has victory over him. And so Anat goes to rescue Baal, and when she goes down there, she kicks Mot's butt and cuts him up into pieces and helps free Baal. But there's the description of how she says, "Oh, I will plow my chest and my back," and that was this description of this cutting yourself, right? And so when the prophets of Baal are on Mount Carmel and they're talking about they're cutting themselves, they're replicating that mythological story of Anat in seeking to have victory over that underworld, right? And so that's where that cutting concept comes from. And again, I brought that all into my Jezebel story because I just found it was very fascinating. But in that time period, Israel was deeply into idolatry. And of course, Jezebel brought Baal worship to Israel and created quite the problem there. So those are some of the interesting components that I found that are actually in the Bible that reflect all these things that we're talking about.
I'm actually looking at the English translation or an English translation of that Canaanite Ugaritic text that you're talking about, which is done by Nicholas Wyatt, who's written a lot of papers related to this subject that I've read over the last few years. And you're right. The skeptics who say that Yahweh is just El, that the Israelites just adopted El and changed his name, you read this text and it's clear that Yahweh is not El. El summoned his drinking companions. El took his seat in his feasting house. He drank wine to satiety. However you pronounce that word. New wine until intoxication. El went off to his house. He stumbled off towards his dwelling. And then two apparently lesser deities, Thukamun and Shanim, supported him. A creeping monster approached him with horns and tail. And there's actually an entry in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible suggesting that this entity may be a Canaanite monster of some sort. And then it continues, El floundered in his own feces and urine. El fell down as though dead. El was like those who go down into the underworld. But I think the point here is that this Marzeah feast was intended to induce an altered state of consciousness, that people, rather than taking psychoactive drugs like, the ancient Canaanite equivalent of ayahuasca, were drinking themselves into a stupor to try to communicate with the spirit realm.
And that's not to say that they weren't using some sort of psychoactive substance, because as we know about antiquity, the really widespread use of those things, there could have been some sort of mixture that's alluded to here. But this is why it's important to study mythology in the context of ritual, because as Brian pointed out, oftentimes the ritual is a reenactment of some segment of a mythological cycle, more often than not. And this is something that's more, again, to put it into wider context, there's a whole subfield of anthropology that's devoted to this, and looking at these sorts of things in, let's say, the context of the last 500 years or so. If people want to read more about that, I'd highly recommend the works of Victor Turner. He's studied the relationship between ritual as a reenactment, theatricality of a theatrical phenomenon, if you will, of mythology.
Judd, you and I talked a little while ago about Chaco Canyon, and that's over in northwestern New Mexico, over by Four Corners. And what something you said, Brian, made me think of that, the circular descending place that they would go to do these rituals. Well, that's basically a kiva, that whatever those people were, the old Puebloans or whoever they were at Chaco Canyon were doing the same thing. And we were talking about how they were using these altered states of consciousness, drugs of some kind, to do that very thing. So we're finding it's not just like this is an ancient Near Eastern thing. This is something that was practiced around the world.
I want to come back to the Egyptian point for just a moment, because I stumbled across a paper by a scholar named Christopher B. Hayes and his co-author Joel Lamont, who argued that a term that I mentioned earlier, Ovoth, meaning spirits of the dead, which derives from Ov, meaning the ritual pit, like you're describing, like the kiva, the ritual pit that the Ov of Endor. And Brian, credit to you for putting me onto the importance of that word, because in David, was it David Ascendant?
Yeah, David Ascendant.
David Ascendant, where I thought it was a brilliant plot device to name, or to point out that the name of one of the giants who almost killed David, Ishvi ben Ov, it's not Ishbi ben Ab, it's the son of the Ov, which Ov means essentially owner of the ritual pit. Well, Hayes and Lamont argued in a paper that term Ovoth may derive from a cognate word in Egyptian, which means, in their word, they believe means, quoting, dead ancestors who could be represented through images. And they point out that in Isaiah chapter 19, Isaiah 19:3, and the spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out, and I will confound their counsel, and they will inquire of the idols and the sorcerers and the mediums, the Ovoth, and the necromancers. Now, I suggested in citing their paper that all it really shows is that there was more cross-pollination of this concept in the ancient world than just, the Amorites and other Semitic people, because the Egyptians were not Amorite, they were not Semitic, but they did worship some of the Amorite deities and clearly had some of these practices, because that term Ovoth, as a scholar named Harry Hoffner showed back in 1966, derives from the Hurrians, who come from way northern Mesopotamia, originating from between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which is where Judd, in his paper, The War of the Words, showed was the origin point for the root behind Eurasian words for royalty and those rulers, and Rephaim as well. So apparently the Hurrians, as they spread out through the Bible, and we know by the time of Abraham, they were as far south as the region of Mount Sinai, because the kings from the east fought against the Horites at the wilderness of Paran, which is Sinai. So this concept apparently spread from the north, from the plains of Ararat with the Hurrians, the Horites, and was spread throughout all of Anatolia, all of the Levant, into what is now Iran, Persia, and even down into Egypt.
And by the way, this is where, this Ove pit and what it's about, it wasn't just something that was used to call up the dead in general, but where Doug was going was the Rephaim. So, at least in the Syrian Canaanite world, which Israel had a heavy interaction with. In fact, it's pretty clear that the Rephaim word in the Bible comes from the Ugarit and the Baal epic and stuff. So and what they call certain scrolls that were called the Rephaim texts, where it describes this connection with these divinized warrior kings. And so the main concept in that world was that the Rephaim referred to when dead warriors, and usually from of old, but when they died, they went down into Hades and they had their council, what they call the Council of Didanu. And of course, Derek has a lot about that we've heard. But they were their belief was that these divinized kings were in the underworld, and that when a new king would be coronated, they would have to have the approval of those dead kings. And so that's where they would contact them, was through that. And the idea was that, they're down there ruling in the underworld, and it's sort of like they're mobsters, ruling from the jail, right? That they still got to get their approval and all that kind of stuff. And so they would actually, that's what their contact would be for that. Now that was their belief. And what is that? Were they real beings? Were they demons? I don't know, but I think that's where the concept basically comes from, and the Israelites know that. And so in Isaiah 14, 9 through 11, there's a prophecy where Isaiah is, again, he's mocking, he's calling judgment upon these mighty kings. And, of course, Isaiah was right around the time of the Assyrian, or he, predicted the Assyrian exile and such. But he's describing that when these mighty kings who think they're mighty, right? And he's comparing them to God. And he says, Sheol is the underworld. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come, these so-called mighty leaders and kings. It rouses the shades. And that's the English word, but the Hebrew behind it is the word Rephaim. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you. So if these are the divinized warrior kings of old, right? All who were leaders of the earth, it raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. So Isaiah is sort of, I think he's being polemical. He's being subversive. He's entering to their storyline and saying, okay, here's what's going to happen to you. Okay, you're going to go down and all these mighty kings are going to greet you. All of them will answer and say to you, and here's where the twist comes. You too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. So I think what he's doing there is he's drawing on that that concept of Rephaim, divine warrior kings, and he's saying, here's the reality. You think you're going to go down and become part of this council of Didanu, the mighty warrior kings, but you're just going to be one of the dead who are sitting there, who are weak. You know, the concept of Sheol was it was dark, they were weak, it was sluggish, it was mucky, all that kind of stuff. And then maggots are your bed. Now, we know literally that's a notion of the grave, but it also becomes a metaphor for what the underworld was like. You know, maggots are the bed beneath your feet and the worms are your covers. And so he's really saying that, you know, I think he's judging that whole mythology and saying it's false, you know, because Yahweh is obviously the creator. So that's one of the little components related to the Rephaim.
Sounds a lot like Elisha on Mount Carmel, you know, when they're cutting themselves and nothing's happening and he just starts mocking them like, what's he sleeping? Is he going to the bathroom?
Yeah.
You know? And the whole point, again, it's the same exact idea. They're compared to the God of gods, this is utterly powerless stuff that you guys are involved in. Whether or not there's a real component to it or not, that's the polemic.
At least, the polemic is before Yahweh, they are nothing.
Yeah. So it seems to me that, tell me if you guys think this is right then. You have on the one hand, you have the cult of the dead, which is a localized thing for probably your own family members, where you're feeding them because you buried them under your house and you keep them around. That's what Dr. Freakman told us when we were standing on the Serpent Mound, and we went into one of these excavated houses, and he shows us right here that we found some figurines that had been broken, and we're standing around, but next to a stela, a rock that had been manipulated to look kind of this curved area where they would kind of incant the dead relative or whatever, and then they would feed it libations or whatever, and this would last for maybe a year or 2 years, however long they wanted, and then at some point in time, they just they ended it. They said, "We're done. Your time is over." So then I guess they would go down to the wheel and they would kind of put the entity to rest or whatever.
Yeah, they would become from the household gods. They would join the ancestors.
Join the ancestors. Yeah. So you've got the level of the local family line or whatever that you're staying in contact with for whatever reasons. But then it seems to me that there's a second level, a higher level, a level of these dead heroes, a level of, you know, when you've got the priests of Baal on top of the mountain, they're not calling grandpa to come and, you know, help them. They're calling upon something much more powerful. And it seems to me that that's the relationship then to not only the Rephaim in the Canaanite world, but the Rephaim in the biblical world, which has definite crossovers to demonic entities and, you know, the origin for unclean spirits in the New Testament, and especially that whole region of Bashan, and this being the land of Og, the Rephaim of, you know, the great Amorite Rephaim and all that kind of stuff. So is that what's happening? Is that you have two different levels of cult worship for the dead?
Yeah.
Good question. I know the household dead, the dead ancestors, were a really important thing for the Amorites. There are texts that have been found where kids who were not sufficiently obedient to their parents were excommunicated, basically, from the household gods. Like the parents would leave a will and say, you know, you have been cut out. You no longer have access to the household gods. But the Kispim ritual that was done for the care and feeding of the ancestral dead was done twice a month for Amorite kings. On the 15th when the moon was full, and then again on the 30th when there was no moon. Because apparently if your deceased ancestors could make trouble for you if you didn't properly care for them in the afterlife, apparently dead kings could really make trouble, and it would apply to the whole kingdom. So this was where the concept of the mortuary garden came into play. In fact, the word for garden in Hebrew, gan, is a cognate for a word in, it's an old Persian dialect from Avestan, and the word is paradisa, from which the Greeks got the word which we now have as paradise. But the word in that Persian dialect meant a ramparted enclosure reserved for the king. So when we think of the garden in the sense of the Garden of Eden, that's what it was. It was a defended, like when Adam and Eve got kicked out. You got the flaming sword that turns every which way, and the cherub throws them out, and they're not allowed back in because this is reserved for the family of the king, basically, which Adam and Eve had just been kicked out of. But it was prostituted. It was bastardized by the fallen realm, and that kings would create these gardens where their cult was, where they were given cult, where they were given worship.
Mm-hmm. Nebuchadnezzar and his hanging gardens.
Yeah, derived exactly like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This is what the original purpose of the garden was: a place, a protected space for the family of the king. And the fallen realm got these kings who aspired to join the assembly of the Ditanu or Tidanu after death, would be worshipped and offered food and drink. In fact, a lot of the statues of the Amorite kings of ancient Syria are shown in their tombs, statues representing them, seated with holding a cup in one hand, where their drink would be put. So
that's wild, Derek. There's when Jesus descends to hell in the ancient church mind, there was a difference of opinion on the idea of paradise that Luke talks about. Like, where was this paradise? And so some are like, well, okay, so he immediately ascended up into heaven, into paradise. But some of them said, no, paradise is actually Abraham's bosom. It's that part of Hades where the good went. And what you're saying here very much sounds like that from a pagan way of thinking about paradise. That, okay, this is the enclosed garden of the king. This is where he rules from. It can't be a coincidence that you have the same word being associated with the underrealm, both with at least the early church, if not Jesus himself, and then with what you're saying with some of these, Akkadian words or whatever.
Yeah, we argued in our book Veneration that paradise was just, say, out of phase with our reality, that it was Eden. And based on that and some other clues in the book of Genesis, we argued that it is at Zion, Jerusalem. So we'll find out someday. I know there were people who argued, no, that was in what is now, Turkey and Iran, and others who say, no, it was ancient Sumer. Like, okay, well, not a salvation issue, so we won't fight about that. But there is a reference in Proverbs 21 to the assembly of the Rephaim. So this was a concept, I think, that was known to the Israelites. One who wanders from the way of good sense will rest in the assembly of the Rephaim. So rather than being something to aspire to, it's like, hey, look, if you wander away from the truth, this is where you're going to end up, and it's not going to be a good thing.
Judd, what do you think? Do you think about kind of a two-tiered level of the cult of the dead?
Well, in one respect, it illustrates the public and private spheres of religion. The household aspect of it, and then the public sphere aspect of it that deals more with the god kings. So in that respect, there is a sort of two-tier element to it. Something else that occurred to me that I wanted to reference was that we've learned quite a bit about Jesus' ministry, and there's hardly any of it that wasn't some form of spiritual warfare. And in thinking about the cult of the dead and communal meals and things of this nature over the last several years, it occurs to me that the sacrament of communion, the Last Supper, is yet another attack on this practice of the assembly of the gods banqueting together, or people in the underworld banqueting together, because this not just the institution of that particular sacrament, but its carrying out. And if you look at the art of early Christianity, let's say up until the end of late antiquity, this idea of heaven being a banquet, which of course is rooted in Scripture to some degree, but it's prolific in the iconography and the art of the church in general for much of its history. But if you look at early Christianity, this was a concept that resonated with them already, at least in some part, because of their pagan lives before becoming Christians. And so it occurs to me that is one aspect of Jesus's ministry that is very much an act of spiritual warfare, in addition to being a fundamental practice in the church going forward.
So check this out. In the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary entry on the cult of the dead, it says several scholars have proposed that the Christian community may have come to the tomb of Jesus to celebrate the resurrection, so that the empty tomb became a type of wheelie or shrine. Pagan opponents accused Christians of preaching a cult of the dead Jesus. One factor would contribute to this misunderstanding is the timing of resurrection appearances. Roman memorial meals were held on the 3rd, 7th, 9th, 30th, and 40th days after death, a chronology that's remarkably close to the gospel sequence of appearances. Also, the custom of meeting early on the first day of the week, perhaps after a vigil the night before, to commemorate the resurrection would tend to reinforce this interpretation among Jews and pagans. The Christian apologists responded that Jesus is risen, not dead. Therefore, their celebrations were not memorial services or meals, but thanksgivings. Paul had a difficult time at Corinth making this distinction clear in 1 Corinthians 11. A service remembering what Jesus did on the night in which he was betrayed is not a wake for the dead Jesus. The Corinthians had opted for the latter interpretation, which would explain the quantities of food they brought to their meetings. Paul's tradition insisted on the former interpretation of the meal in the upper room.
You know, there was a prohibition against eating meat that was sacrificed in the Mosaic Law on the 3rd day after it was sacrificed. You could eat it on the first day or the second day, but anyone who ate it on the 3rd day was that was just right out. And I was looking for the reference to it because I've got it referenced in one of our books, and I am forgetting which one now, so I am searching for it.
That's what you get, Derek, for all the stuff that you write.
I think it's an age thing. You get to a point where I don't remember which book that was in anymore. But anyway, yeah, there are a couple of prohibitions in Leviticus against eating on the 3rd day because it was known that, as you said, the pagans, Greece and Rome, would eat their sacrificial meal for the dead on the 3rd day, which may have some reference or some reason then that it was not allowed. But yeah, that 3rd day motif is rather prominent in ancient Mesopotamia even. In fact, in the Rephaim text that Brian mentioned earlier, the Rephaim are summoned to a ritual meal at the threshing floor of El, or the tabernacle of El, which would be the summit of Mount Hermon. And they mount their chariots, travel first one day and then another, and then they arrive at dawn of the 3rd day. In the descent of Inanna, which is the story of Inanna, Ishtar, going into the netherworld to try to usurp her sister's kingdom. Her sister was queen of the underworld. Ereshkigal knew what Inanna was trying to do, and so she fixed Inanna with the stare of death and hung her on a hook. Like in Johnny Dangerously. Shouldn't hang me on a hook, Johnny. My father hung me on a hook once. But she is freed by the magical workings of a couple of her demonic assistants, and she arrives back in the upper world on the 3rd day. So
would we say then that at least one of the applications of what Jesus did, both in the in the meal before he died as a memorial, but then also, when he's raised from the dead, and then they're meeting in the upper room, and they're around a meal, and there's all these meals that take place even in Luke's gospel afterwards, that this is a polemic against the cult of the dead, that Jesus is the answer to the cult of the dead. And just like Christian said, because you think that we're worshiping a dead king or a hero, but the reality is that he's conquered death. And this cult of the dead needs to go away. I was reminded, I was thinking about the gladiator scene in the first Gladiator movie, where right before he goes out for that final time into the arena, he pulls out his family little, almost like teraphim or whatever, and he just starts praying to them, to remember me and give me strength, and I want to honor you and that kind of stuff. I don't remember if Maximus, I don't think that he in that movie has any kind of a Christian outlook on life. So that's reflecting very much Roman kind of sensitivities to this stuff. But
yeah. But it does show you too, like how thoroughly embedded it was in that world. Like we hear that now, and it would be hard to believe. What do you mean? Is all that's they're saying all that stuff about Jesus to go be polemically against the cult of the dead? Like we have no concept of that in our modern society, right? It's so alien to us. But
yeah, because Jesus was victorious. That's why we have no concept of it.
Yeah. He actually had victory over the underworld itself. Right. He conquered death itself. Yeah, right. No, absolutely. But that's part of the problem of our bias. Yeah. We don't. We've been swimming in our blessings for so long. We don't realize the kind of world.
Most of us, though. But this is a very Western view. I mean, go to Mexico, the Day of the Dead. Okay.
Yeah.
Go to Africa, where they on Madagascar, their ancestors live in better homes than the people of Madagascar, and they have to bring them out of these homes, these tombs, every few years and rewrap the bodies and dance with them to keep the ancestors happy. China, Vietnam, even South Korea. The Roman Catholic Church had to give the South Koreans in the Roman Catholic Church a special dispensation to continue with the little family shrines there because they wouldn't stop doing it. So this really has not ended in the modern world. In fact, there are more of them who are still praying to the ancestors, especially in the Southern Hemisphere and the Far East, than we might think. And this can all be traced back to the sin on the summit of Mount Hermon when the Watchers came down and said, "Okay, we're going to do this thing and corrupt humanity." Even on in the summer of love back in 2020, when you were hearing people saying, "Say the name," and they were calling out the names of those who had fallen in encounters with the police, and then ending it by saying "Ashe" and pouring out a drink offering, that echoes the exact format of the kiss boom ritual of the ancient Canaanites, the ancient Amorites. You would summon your ancestors by summoning them by name and concluding the ritual meal by pouring out a drink offering. I mean, I've got video that I've saved of them doing this inside a Methodist church in Los Angeles.
So we're not as scientific after all, are we?
We're
never going to escape
not.
our spiritual nature. That's very fascinating.
Yeah. So this is not as far removed from us in the present day, even in America, as we would like to think. And we can trace it back to Genesis chapter 6. Well, fascinating stuff. And I think a little eye-opening to Christians. Because, when I started pulling on this Rephaim thread years ago, I just thought, well, okay, this is weird and it's in the Bible. I just want to know more about it. And the more you dig into it, the more you realize this is woven all through. And I'm glad that you guys are seeing the same thing with the Last Supper, that because Sharon and I have been talking about this in our Bible studies for a while now, but there aren't many of us out there who see it this way. So nice to know we're not crazy, at least not on that particular point.
No, it's nice to know you have a larger circle of crazy people with you.
That's it. We're going sane in a crazy world. That's what's happening.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, fellows, look forward to joining you for another Iron and Myth next month. Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, Dr. Judd Burton, thanks again, and we will talk again soon. Click the links in the notes below, whether you're watching or listening, for the websites to Judd Burton, Doug Van Dorn and Brian Godawa. Straight ahead, what may be the most hilarious new piece of legislation introduced into Congress in my lifetime. I will explain that and give you more details, including speakers now, lists of speakers for the conferences coming up for us through the end of 2025. That and more straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues.
The 10 plagues of Moses and the Exodus were judgment upon the gods of Egypt, because those gods were demonic reality. Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history. The War of Gods and Men. A must-read. Moses Against the Gods of Egypt and Other Supernatural Historical Novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
God's creation is full of mysteries. What were the giants in the Scripture? Did dinosaurs roam the earth in the days of Noah? Are we alone in the universe? Join speakers L.A. Marzulli, Derek Gilbert, Michael Hoggard, Mac Dominic, Sharon Gilbert, and Micah Van Huss to explore the topics your Sunday school teacher didn't talk about at the Mysteries of the Bible Verse event in the greater Indianapolis area, June 13th and 14th.
Talking the walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at vftb.net. Our main website is gilberthouse.org. My personal site, derekpgilbert.com. Social media, we're on X, formerly Twitter, at View from Bunker. Not enough characters in the name here for the. At Derek Gilbert at @GilbertHouse_TV. Also on Facebook, the View from the Bunker page there. Truth Social and Gab at Derek P. Gilbert. We're on Substack now. Please subscribe there to get free articles drawn from our books. Right in the middle of a series now taken from my book, Bad Moon Rising, about the spiritual forces behind Islam. Gilberthouse.substack.com. Gilberthouse.substack.com. And you'll also find us on Telegram at View from the Bunker, at View from the Bunker. On YouTube, it is at Gilbert House. Please subscribe, share, click the bell for notifications, hit that like button, and then download our free mobile app to guarantee we never get canceled. That is at gilberthouse.org/app. We've got versions for all of your mobile devices, iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle, Fire. Also, for all your smart TV devices, Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV. If you got a smart TV preloaded, hey, get the Gilbert House TV, the GHTV, the Gilbert House Ministries app installed and bring all of our video content right to your smart device, your smartphone or tablet. Yes, we are all about the smart devices. I say that laughingly because this is my second take through this particular trial, and it's just as well. For whatever reason, the computer decided to stop recognizing the USB microphone, which meant that the audio was going through the webcam up there, which, okay, you could hear what I was saying, but the audio was awful. It was awful. And being an old radio guy, audio really matters. So anyway, we're going at this a second time through, and it's just as well, because last time through, it went way too long. The back half of the program went way too long, and I got way too aggravated. And that's really not what I want to do, because I don't really want to come across that way, and I don't want to leave you feeling that way after watching these programs. So I will skip over all of the stuff that I had said before, except for this, because I think this is hilarious. And if we watch politics for no other reason, it should be for hilarity, because we got enough serious stuff going on. I mean, look, let's worry about the Great Commission. Preach gospel, make disciples of all nations. And nations, by the way, not nation state. That's ethnos in Greek, which means all ethnicities. Okay, regardless of skin color, where they're from, that's what we're called to do. preach the gospel, and baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is a declaration of victory. 1 Peter 3, beginning at verse 18, when Jesus went down into the netherworld, he proclaimed to the spirits in prison. And then Peter equated that to baptism. And by the way, the Greek word translated spirits into English does not refer to human spirits unless it's specifically qualified as such. So Jesus went down, declared victory, and Peter equated that to baptism. That's why we baptize. Hey, we got another one. So let's worry about that and leave the politics. Yeah, it's important and all that, but we're not saving anybody at the ballot box. But it is fun to watch, if for no other reason than to see the deep state losing its mind. And they are losing their minds again this week because of a piece of legislation introduced by Georgia Republican Buddy Carter. Buddy Carter, House Resolution 1161, introduced into the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It will never make it out of committee to the full House for a vote. But it is hilarious. And this bill, if it were passed, and it's not going to pass, so don't worry about it, but it's just worth talking about because it's hilarious. Authorizes the president to go ahead, buy Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. And, speaking seriously, there are some good reasons for doing that. It's got rare earth metals. It's strategically placed. There's some good reasons for the United States. And hey, this is not a new thing. The U.S. has tried to do this 4 times previously. So it's not, and let's be glad that William Seward, back in the days of, the middle of the 19th century, 1868, bought Alaska for $2 an acre or something from Russia. That was a pretty good deal. So, anyway, Carter's bill would authorize the president to buy Greenland and then rename it from Greenland to Red, White, and Blueland, which would, again, just be hilarious. Again, it'll never get out of committee, but Representative Carter clearly has a sense of humor. Well, we've got a few conferences coming up. In fact, next weekend, we will probably not have a View from the Bunker episode next week. A lot going on between now and then. I'm going to be speaking at the 24/7 Men's Discipleship Weekend, Thursday night, February 20th, through Sunday morning, February 23rd, 8 times. The theme of the weekend at the Valley View Bible Camp in McGregor, Manitoba, is Giants, Gods, and Dragons, recovering the biblical worldview of the apostles and prophets. So, little busy preparing my 8 talks, presentations, but also because we've got a big winter storm coming in. We're expected to get anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of snow on Tuesday, and I've got an early Wednesday flight out of the Springfield-Branson National Airport. So probably losing a day there, go up there a day early, stay the night in a hotel. Did find that by staying in the hotel for the night and then going to the airport on the shuttle, I can park my car a lot cheaper at the hotel than I can at the airport. So, winning. And because of that and some other stuff going on, just will not have time to get a new View from the Bunker out next weekend. Don't know if there's still time to sign up for the weekend, but if you're interested, there's more information at the Valley View Bible Camp's website. This is about 90 minutes west of Winnipeg. valleyviewbiblecamp.com. valleyviewbiblecamp.com. Click the events tab in the top menu bar, and that'll take you to the link for the 24/7 Men's Discipleship Weekend. Now, April 10th through 12th, 2025, Sharon and I honored to be among the speakers at the Aliens, AI, and the Antichrist conference. I mean, these are topics that are right up our alley. I mean, we just wrote a book about, AI and how it might be opening literally the gates of hell. That's why we opened the book, The Gates of Hell, with a fictional scenario that Sharon wrote, brilliant, about a sentient AI that goes rogue. Aliens, also co-authored a book recently with Donna Howell and Allie Anderson called Destination Earth. So probably be talking about that there. I'll leave AI for Sharon. This will be at Blue Eye, Missouri, down at Morningside. And attendance, if you want to see this in person, L.A. Marzulli, Carl Gallups, Alan DiDio, Joe Artis-Horn, Dave Robbins, Vicki Joy Anderson, Sharon and me, no charge. You can attend for free. So if you're in the Ozarks or near the Ozarks, you might consider coming and seeing us, but you do need to register in advance because seating is limited. And, you got to abide by fire code regulations and that sort of thing. So you can find out more at Ready Now Expo, all one word, readynowexpo.com. And if you can't make it, you can stream it. And the cost of streaming is very reasonable, just $25. But if you register between now and the end of the month, February 28th, you can get an early bird discount, just $18 to stream the Aliens, AI, and the Antichrist Conference. In June, we'll be in the Indianapolis area. Carmel will be at the Drury Plaza Hotel. This is on North Meridian, just north of Indianapolis. June 13th and 14th with L.A. Marzulli. I think everywhere we are this year, we're stalking L.A. L.A. Marzulli, Pastor Mike Hoggard, Mac Dominic, Micah Van Huff, Sharon and I are both speaking twice at this conference. I'll be delivering one of the keynote addresses. I'm not sure Friday or Saturday, but June 13th and 14th at the Drury Plaza, Mysteries of the Bible Verse 2025. You can register at marginalmysteries.com. marginalmysteries.com for that one. In July, we'll be in Ohio, Brookville, Ohio. That's just outside Dayton. For the Go Therefore conference, we'll be at the Harvest Revival Center, Pastor Neil Peterson's church there, Dr. Michael Lake, David Heavener, Joe Artis Horn, Vicki Joy Anderson, Pastor Casper McLeod, Tom Dunn, Kenny C., Sharon, and me. And if you can be there, great. It's a great facility. Neil Peterson and his church are very welcoming. Great, big video screen behind us. So we take advantage of that to show our slides and streaming, video stuff. And streaming video, speaking of, will be available for this conference. You can sign up for either in-person and or streaming video. So you can go back and watch videos later. If, you got to step out, get a snack, whatever. You can watch the full video presentation, share it with your friends, family, church members later on. GoThereforeConference.com. GoThereforeConference.com. Then in August, another conference here in the Ozarks. We got two in our backyard this year. The Remnant Rising Conference from Hear the Watchmen. This is in Springfield, Missouri at the Oasis Hotel. That is the Oasis Hotel and Convention Center. L.A. Marzulli, again, Pastor Paul Begley, Joe Artis Horn, Donna Howell, Nita Horn, Vicki Joy Anderson, Tracy Tennant, Jamie Walden, and Sharon and me. So this is close enough to the airport, the Springfield Branson National Airport, that if you fly in, you can take an airport shuttle directly to the hotel. Great hotel, great facility. We've seen pictures of it. I know people have stayed there and really loved the hotel. And if you're coming in on I-44 from the east, it is just 10 minutes from the new Buc-ee's. Been there once. It's like it's got its own zip code. I see now why look, Sharon and I, we're not shoppers, but I can see why some people just absolutely love Buc-ee's. So if that's your thing, come in on 44, stop at the Buc-ee's. But I'll tell you what, if you're in Springfield, you're just 45 minutes from Branson. So there's a lot to do there. But Springfield has a world-class, I'm not exaggerating, a world-class aquarium. It's been voted best in the U.S. 3 years running now. It's attached to Bass Pro #1, the original Bass Pro. So guys, come, bring the family, send them over to the aquarium, and then do your shopping. This will be, again, August 22nd through 24th at the Oasis Hotel and Convention Center. Take advantage of what the Ozarks has to offer. Great time of year to be here. A little warm, but a lot of activities nearby. And, of course, then our trip to Israel in October, that is on. We are told now that the north of Israel is open, which is good because there are a lot of places we go that are kind of off the beaten track, but in the north, the Golan Heights, Gilgal Rephaim, we showed the video of that, and Kerbet Beteha, which is the other similar site to Gilgal Rephaim, overlooking the Jordan. We want to take you there. We also want to take you to the massive Shamir Dolman. That's the one with the 50-ton capstone. That's like two 18-wheel tractor trailers. A 50-ton capstone. And again, it's in the Upper Galilee, which is an area that we talked about on Iron and Myth, because as Dr. Judd Burton would say, it is pregnant with meaning. Find out more at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel, gilberthouse.org/travel. Thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, as the case may be. And if you're subscribing and listening audio through Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, or wherever fine podcasts are sold, please take a moment, give us a good review. Helps us with the algorithms, and we sure appreciate it. Our announcer is the inimitable D.C. Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives, mind you, 4.0 international license. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker.